Sidekick here with my first impressions and mini review of the F4-E. For full transparency, I need to let you know that Heatblur did provide me with an advanced copy of the F4. It was not that far in advance, but it was an advanced copy, and I appreciated it. But the aircraft that I am flying now is the aircraft that I purchased the license to back in October when they first went on sale. So I'm going to give you my first impressions of the F4, based on mostly trying to go out and drop ordnance on targets on the ground, I have to admit, but a little bit of just general flying around as well. My opinions may very well change as I get used to the module. There is an awful lot to learn, but I think it's important to give you my first impression, so that's what I'm going to do. The too long didn't read version, for those of you who are interested, is that the F4-E by Heatblur is a work of art. It is clearly constructed by a team that is passionate about getting the details right, and who believe that if they assemble a work of art from those details, that the result will be pleasing for players to fly as it was for them to build. Are they right? Well, that's going to depend on what you're looking for and what you appreciate in a DCS aircraft, and also whether or not you have any friends, but I'll explain that at the end. So let me go into a little bit more detail. Let me first say something about how I'm going to and how I honestly think you should evaluate the F4 when you fly it. It is very important, I think, not to compare backwards, but compare forwards, and I'll explain what I mean. Players will often get in the plane and compare it to ones that they have already flown. Now, this is unfortunate if what you have flown are modern jets, because no one is trying to make the F4 be better than the F-16 or the F-15E or the F-18. Heatblur did not make the F4 to give you a better plane to fly on multiplayer servers so you can flex on all the poor sods who can't afford to buy one yet. They tried to make a faithful representation of an aircraft that existed at a particular moment in time and configured in a particular way. It was an aircraft that was designed and redesigned with particular missions in mind, to be flown by pilots that were trained in a particular way. All of this colors why it looks and flies the way that it does. The challenge, though, for Heatblur, I think, is that the F4 is perhaps the single most ubiquitous fighter airframe from the heart of the Cold War. It was used by a multitude of air forces in a multitude of roles, and it appeared in a multitude of variants and subvariants. But the model in DCS can only really represent a single instance of the F4. That single instance may not be exactly the one that a particular player has been waiting for. To address that issue, though, Heatblur has provided an almost endless possibilities to configure the airplane the way you want to. But this in itself poses a challenge. Many of the possible configurations are physically possible, it's true, but they're not configurations that would have ever flown on an actual jet. For reasons of doctrine or training or the laws of physics, that might not be all that obvious to everyone, some of the configurations that you can create just never would have happened in real life. In all of which means that players in DCS can configure the Phantom and fly it in circumstances that in which it never would have been expected to perform well, or even adequately. So be cautious of the criticisms you hear around the community about the F4, quote-unquote, not working. These assertions are a question, mostly, I think, of inappropriate expectations, not of poor design. But also be cautious about assuming that flying the F4 will be something you're going to enjoy, because honestly, that's going to have as much to do with your expectations as with the module itself. So, I've been thinking all of that over and trying to decide how to give the module a fair review, one that's fair, but one that also gives you information about what you can expect so you can compare it to your expectations. And I've also been trying to manage my own expectations fairly. So I think a lot of what I'm going to do is to try to see the F4 through the eyes of those who would have seen it for the first time, as we are. the pilots and wizzos and other Air Force personnel who operated and maintained the jet. Now, to do that, you kind of have to think about what they knew and what they were used to. So that means comparing the F4 to jets of the same or maybe a slightly earlier era. Now, the only problem in DCS is that's a problem because there aren't any in DCS, or not very many. Now, thankfully, there is the A4-E, which was very much an immediate predecessor to the F4 in the Navy. And there's the F-14, which was its immediate successor in the Navy service as the Fleet Defender. Unfortunately, on the Air Force side, we really don't have anything to compare the F4 to that was of comparable vintage. We don't have an F-100 or an F-104 or an F-105. So, for much of this video, you will hear me comparing, either explicitly or implicitly, you'll hear me comparing the F4 to the A4 and the F-14. Anyways, let's just start by talking about what it's like to fly. Well, it's a blast. It just feels, well, like I expected it to feel. Well, actually, that's not true. It actually flies easier than I thought it would, which I think is related to Heatblur's choice of the late model F4-E as their choice of the subject of the module. And basically, it's all down to those slats, baby. Well, that and an air data computer. See, understand that you need to remember that the F4 was designed in an era when designers had not yet figured out how to combine high-speed performance and low-speed handling. If you fly a lot of planes in DCS, you will notice that older planes, especially those from this era, are not as forgiving as the new ones. They fly and feel very different at low speeds than they do at high speeds. If you've ever tried to carry or land the F-14 or the A4, especially when they're heavy, which I don't recommend, by the way, you'll know what I mean. Or if you've ever tried to dogfight in the Mirage F1 as speed bleeds off. Or if you've ever tried to land the Viggen on a forest runway. You know what I'm talking about. In these jets, what at high speed is a powerful or nimble high-performance machines turns into a wallowing tub of goo that seems as intent on killing you slowly as it does doing anything else when you slow down. It does this in ways that modern jets don't. And this is a testament to the art and science of aerospace engineers that took fighter design from 1955, when the work started on the F4, to 1990. In that time, they managed to find a host of ways to improve low-speed handling without compromising high-end performance. Things like wing leading edges and fly-by-wire and a host of other features that are largely transparent to the average sim pilot, but which matter a lot and are basic features of almost every fighter nowadays. It's why, for instance, in the era that we're talking about, in the late 60s and early 70s, that was the era of the variable geometry wing for aircraft like the F-14, the F-111, the MiG-23. And that was also the era of the very first air data computers. In other words, the first attempts to provide automatic control of flight surfaces. A control that was really beyond the sensory capacity of most human pilots, and it was a big deal. In fact, I'd argue that the modern solutions to the fast and slow problem amounted to, actually it turned out rather than full variable geometry wings, what we needed was computer-controlled variable microgeometry of the wings. Designers found that with slats, flaps, flaperons, stabilators, controlled by the computer, they could substantially improve the slow-speed handling of jets, including the F4, which is pretty much what the E model is all about. So, all of which is a long way of getting around to answering how does it fly? The answer is remarkably well, until you get to the edge of its performance envelope, and you have to get pretty close to it before it's an issue. But the one difference between the F4-E and a full fly-by-wire system is that the F4 can't keep you from making mistakes, which a lot of fly-by-wire systems frankly do. So in the end, I find the flight model of the F4 very satisfying. The performance of the jet varies substantially with speed. It's not the same airplane at Mach 0.8 as it is at Mach 0.5 or below. It also relies heavily on thrust to solve most of its problems, but then it really does have a lot of that. The old adage that the F4 is a triumph of afterburner over aerodynamics certainly feels true in the cockpit. And even at low speeds, it's not unpleasant or difficult to fly, but it does need you to pay attention. You need to be very gentle and smooth with the controls, and you need to think with your feet. Rudder does matter in the F4 in a way that it doesn't in a lot of modern jets. In short, it's going to punish you for sloppy flying, even if that sloppy flying works very well in an F-18 or F-16. But it's going to be punish you for sloppy flying in ways that are quite familiar to you if you fly the A4 or the Tomcat or the Mirage F1. So, that feels right to me. I don't know what it was like to fly an F4, but the F4-E module in DCS certainly meets my expectations, which in itself is no small achievement by Heatblur. Until you watch yourself from the outside when you're flying, especially even at fairly substantial speed, you don't realize just how active those slats are and how they are effectively keeping you in the heart of your ever-decreasing performance envelope as your speed drops. So for basic flying, the flight model of the F4 gets a solid yeah baby from me. It recreates an experience that is different from any other in DCS, but which feels right to me and which fits with the other aircraft of the time, which is about as far as I can validate it. Okay, so that's what it's like to fly the Phantom, but what is it like to fight the Phantom? Flying is only a means to an end in DCS, right? Well, that's where opinions are likely to start diverging a little about the F4. If you're looking for something that looks and feels right down to the lowest detail, you're going to love the Phantom. If you're looking to get in the cockpit and be effective at employing ordnance, maybe not so much, because the Phantom is not an easy plane to learn to use, particularly if you're a digital native or someone who has gone digitally native in DCS. And the reason that the Phantom is as complicated as it is because it doesn't automate many of the tasks that modern fighters do. And many of those tasks are the same kind of tasks we are used to having automated in our modern life. When you sit in the F4, you will immediately notice that it has a lot more switches and dials and lights than a modern cockpit does. It also has a lot more of those things than aircraft came before it, like the A4. And that's because it arrived at a time when aircraft systems were becoming much more complex, but the computing power to monitor, control, synthesize all of that complexity did not yet exist. Those jobs had to be done by a human in the loop. Two humans, actually. And this is where we're going to get to one of the issues with the F4, because not for nothing is the F4 a multi-crew aircraft, just like the F-14. The guy in back was not just extra weight. In that generation of aircraft, there was simply no way to reduce the workload of managing the jet's combat systems down to a level that could be done with competence, while also flying the plane competently. It just wasn't possible to have that much mental bandwidth. Take for instance something as simple as a lay-down bombing task, flying straight and level over a target at a fixed speed, so that you can drop bombs accurately on it. In a modern fighter, with a HUD, this may not be all that easy, but it's a job that is manageable by one pilot because you don't need to split your attention between lining up on the target and keeping your numbers where they're supposed to be. It's all in front of you, there, on the HUD, in easy-to-read symbology. In the F4, you have to split your attention between head-down data that appears on an analog dial, like attitude, speed, altitude, and head-up data, the target. If you, for instance, miss your attitude by even a degree or two, your accuracy is actually going to suffer dramatically. If your head is in the cockpit reading the numbers, it's pretty easy to find you're offline or that you missed the pickle point as it goes by at 500 miles an hour. So what you really need is that second pilot to call your numbers, to relieve you of the need to keep your focus inside the cockpit. You focus on the target. And your Wizzo tells you what your speed is, and your Wizzo tells you what your altitude is, and maybe even what your attitude is like. And I'm beginning to realize that's really the job that I need a Wizzo for. So, and a great number of weapons employments tasks in the F4 do require two sets of eyes on the instruments as well as on the combat system in order for them to be done well. The short list includes employing optically guided ordnance, employing Mavericks because you got to fly the aircraft pretty precisely to be able to acquire Employing Pave Spike, same thing. Employing the Sparrow at beyond visual ranges. Laydown attacks, loft attacks. The list goes on. It goes on for a bit, actually. Now, Heatblur has done an amazing job of giving you an artificially intelligent set of eyeballs for a number of these tasks. His name is Jester. But it's still not really the same as having a guy in back to help you in the way that you need help, because that's going to be personal to you. So effectively, the bottom line is this. If you're flying the F4-E in single player, you are experiencing a state-of-the-art, high-fidelity simulation of exactly half the problem. The other half of the problem is being abstracted by Jester. And while Jester is good, he's in no way a high fidelity a simulation of a human as the front cockpit is of an F4 cockpit. So, does this mean you shouldn't buy the F4? Of course not. I mean, at least for me, there was never any way that I wasn't going to want to sit in that high-fidelity cockpit and get as clear a picture as possible about how this icon really worked and flew. It was not possible for me to say no. But I am realizing that if I really want to complete the experience, I need to either get a nose gunner or a guy in back to fly with me. I am enjoying and will continue to enjoy flying the F4-E in DCS, but I know that I will only be getting a fraction of the experience if I'm doing it alone. Really, seriously. To get the full benefit of the huge amount of work that Heatblur has done, you need to fly full multi-crew. You really do. At the end of the day, I mean, how could it be anything but true? The whole point of Heatblur's approach was to build a simulation that was built in high fidelity from the ground up to operate as closely as possible to the real thing. The problem is that the real thing was designed to be operated by two pilots. Pilots who were much more at home with switches and dials and checklists and not with screens and button clicks. That's who you have to be if you want to enjoy the F4-E to its full extent. So if you want to get the most out of this module, you have to be part of that simulation, and you need to have a buddy who wants to go with you. So go do that, because this really is an experience you don't want to miss.